In most of the world, the job of coroner is a fairly dismal one, usually being in charge of death pronouncements and investigations. But in England, there is a weird additional perk to the job that can't be found anywhere else in the world. You see, in Britain, the coroner has the job of determining if something counts as a treasure trove. Seeing as the only thing dead bodies and treasure have in common is that they are both often found buried in the ground, it's hard to see how they ended up getting the job and ended up becoming the Baron of Booty. Well, today we're going to be going over what this job entails, how this came about, and how this dark job ended up getting a bit of a brighter side. So, to understand how all this came about, we're going to have to dive into the history of coroners and why they were created in the first place. The job goes fairly far back in history, all the way back to 1194. The English crown was strapped for cash after spending excessively on the Crusades. And to help to make sure that the king's coffers got what they were due, they needed a new bureaucratic position to act locally on the crown's behalf. Someone who could help settle local matters and ensure that revenue or property that was due to the crown was properly being collected. The current Archbishop of Canterbury was the one tasked with creating a solution to this problem, and thus created the job of coroner. The name roughly meaning one that crowns or of the crown, which was chosen because the job of coroner is basically acting as a local representative of the crown in a municipality. They were put in charge of organizing juries, supervising county elections, conducting death investigations, and seizing the assets of the deceased if they had no heirs that could be found. This early version of a coroner was much more akin to a local tax collector than the arbiter of death that it is today, and the job duties varied quite a bit from one location to another, as they initially weren't set by any kind of national standards. One of the most important parts of the job was to investigate local matters, and most importantly, determine if anything was due to the crown because of it. One thing that this included was what was to be done if valuable treasure was found without any clear title of ownership, as unclaimed treasure was by law owned by the crown. But before we get further into how this job ended up changing into our modern version, let's first talk about what constitutes treasure and what happens when it's found. Although it may seem obvious, having a standard definition of what legally constitutes treasure is fairly important, and after receiving several strongly worded letters from my local coroner insisting that the real treasure is in fact not the friends I made along the way, I figured it would be best to just look up what is legally considered a treasure trove according to British law. And by the Treasure Act of 1996, a treasure has to meet one of the following criteria. 1. If the object is not a coin, it must be at least 300 years old and composed of at least 10% precious metal, either gold or silver, by weight. Number 2. If the object is a coin, it must be either one of at least 2 coins in the same fine which are at least 300 years old at the time, and are at least 10% precious metal by weight, or one of at least 10 coins in the same fine that are at least 300 years old at that time. 3. Any object at least 200 years old when found that belongs to a class of objects of outstanding historical, archaeological, or cultural importance that has been designated as treasure by the Secretary of State. 4. Any object which would have been a treasure trove if found before the 24th of September 1997. 5. Any object which when found is part of the same fine as an object within one of the headings of 1 through 4 that would have been previously dated at the same time or earlier, or an object found earlier which could be in heading 1, 2, and 3 above, which has been found at the same time. Treasure does not include unworked natural objects or minerals that were found in a natural deposit, or objects that have been designated not treasure by the Secretary of State. Objects falling within the definition of wreck are also not treasure. Now, if you found that definition both painful to listen to and confusing, welcome to Introduction to Law. And if someone finds anything they think may qualify as treasure, since who the heck is going to know, understand, and follow the aforementioned atrocity of a definition, they have to notify the coroner within 14 days, or face potential fines or jail time. The coroner will then hold an inquest and determine if the find does in fact qualify as treasure or not. In addition to this, the coroner is also in charge of finding and notifying any parties with a potential interest in the treasure, such as current landowners and occupiers, other parties who could be considered finders, or anyone else with a potential claim, such as prior landowners or occupiers. Now, the coroner is not in charge of legally determining if someone does have the title to the find, just if they potentially could have a claim to it, so they can be notified and participate in the coroner's inquest, which is handled by the courts, and that's what will determine it. One of the important powers that a coroner has is the ability to investigate a find, including summoning and questioning witnesses. And this isn't just in a kind of, oh, if you have time, would you answer a couple of questions for me kind of way. You would be held in contempt of court if you decide not to comply with the investigation. So they do have some real power here. If the coroner decides that the find does not qualify as treasure, it is released to the person who found it. But if it is, it'll be claimed by the Crown, and the person finding it will be rewarded the full market value as determined by the Treasure Valuation Committee. The treasure is then offered for sale to local and national museums at this value. So how did things go from the local hand of the Crown to dead bodies and treasure only? Well, a lot of it comes down to what basically starts as them being detectives. The earliest job duties were investigating and then tracking down next of kin or other people related to whatever was going on. Basically, early forensics and detective work, with many times having to determine if someone has a potential claim of ownership on very limited information. As time went on, things became more streamlined and standardized. Job duties were stripped away until they were left with death investigations and treasure. And if you think about it, the two do have many similarities and overlapping skill sets. Both involve making an initial investigation, finding, notifying, and questioning involved parties, determining next of kin or people with potential claims of ownership for either treasure or the possessions of the deceased, and handling the potential transfer of ownership to the Crown or otherwise after an inquest and court proceedings have been concluded. So why is this something we only see in England and not in other countries that have coroners? Well, it's most likely that when the job of coroner was being spread across the world, the vast majority of the job entailed doing death investigations. And at this point, medical science had advanced to the point where the job required medical training to be done properly. This meant that as other nations started to adopt the job into their municipal infrastructure, it didn't make much sense to include both death investigations and treasure. Britain was unique because it was one of the first ones to legally explore how treasure should be handled, and its history meant that it had many potential treasures to be found, with many complicated potential claims of ownership, along with a government that was uniquely interested in how this treasure would be handled. After hundreds of years of legal and forensic advancements, it became clear that breaking apart these responsibilities would be a pretty sensible thing to do. So, coroners being in charge of treasure in England is a sort of municipal vestigial tale. As the job matured and became specialized, it lost most of its other duties. But treasure stuck around because it still required many of the same skills and legal authorities. And keeping the responsibilities together was never so detrimental to the point where it was worth separating them in terms of time and effort. Since countries adopted the profession later, it was much easier to just add another department that handled treasure instead. Well, that's it for coroners and treasure. Do you think that England's system has it right, or should they give up this remnant of the medieval era? Honestly, if I was a British coroner, which oddly enough I could possibly do, I would tell them that the only way they could take my treasure was if they pried it from my cold, dead hands. Either way, I'm Frank Ciopatini with Servetti Software, and thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.